So welcome back to my second part of the presentation about George Edmund Street, who was born in 1824. So we're celebrating this year in 2024 his bicentenary of his birth. And I've entitled this whole presentation International Man of Gothic. And it's really in this second part of the presentation, we'll see why he deserves that title. What we're going to have a look at this part of the presentation are his religious buildings in London. We're going to have a look at that work overseas that I've mentioned. We'll have a look at his architectural masterpiece, which is the Royal Courts of Justice. We'll briefly have a look at his domestic life, and we'll have a look at the end of his life and where he's buried today. So let's start off in the capital city, and you've got to remember Victorian London was arguably the most important city in the world. It was probably one of the richest cities in the world and one of the largest cities in the world. It was the headquarters not only of a thriving Britain, but a thriving British Empire. And what Street produced in a growing economy in this age of Victorian England were churches of beauty and elegance. This was an architect who knew how to combine both form and function in a stunning manner. He also produced his secular masterpiece, which I'll mention at the introduction, the Royal Courts of Justice, and we'll definitely have a look at that into detail about that building in due course. So, GE hits London, and we have a look on the right-hand side of one of his absolute stunning buildings. This is St James Less in Pimlico. Now, if you know London, Pimlico is where Tate Britain is located, and it's quite a gentrified, affluent area these days, but that wasn't the case when Street built his church in this area. So much so that this striking, attractive church was built in amongst urban slums. So it was described by the London Illustrated News in 1861 as a lily among the weeds. And just have a look there at that wonderful, bright, different coloured, the polychromy brickwork where he's using different colours just to give a striking visual effect, but also to give that Gothic pointed arch to the church's entrance. It really is a remarkable entrance and gives you the perfect introduction into the walking into the building. As for the building itself, its interior, again, is eye-catching and jaw-dropping. The St James the Less was built in 1858 to 1861, and it really is an example of Gothic revival at its very best. Sumptuous interiors, but with very much a European Lombardic influences, so the Italian Renaissance from the Lombardy area of Italy. Street not only had a very enlightened apprenticeship working under George Gilbert Scott, but he also created and combined with wonderfully talented people. So what I've put here on this slide, Team Street. The senior clerk in the practice was a gentleman called Philip Webb, who was strongly involved in the construction of one of our most interesting pieces of domestic architecture in the country, which is the Red House. Now, Webb created the Red House in tandem with another famous man from Victorian times, another famous creator artist, was William Morris, who was an apprentice at the architectural work where Street was. Richard Norman Shaw was also involved. Now, Norman Shaw was responsible for a number of notable buildings, such as Old Scotland Yard in Westminster in London, and also the Albion House, which is the White Star building in Liverpool. So, you think of that talented team of Street, of Webb, of Morris and Norman Shaw. It's like the architectural equivalent to Motown Records. And heading that, the Marvin Gaye of the whole movement was very much George Edmund Street. So I talked about Norman Shaw. His building in Liverpool is the the eye-catching building on the left-hand side, and the red house that I've talked about on the previous slide by Webb and William Morris is the building on the right-hand side. So you can see this was architecture both on a domestic context, but also for commercial use too. Mentioned on part one of the presentation how important Street's architectural books were. And indeed, this can be seen again on this slide. In 1855, the brick and marble architecture of northern Italy was published and received rave reviews in terms of just the artistic quality and the influence. You know, this was not a man who, when he went traveling as part of the Grand Tour, went for idle leisure. He really went to study and learn about the buildings. And in 1865, he published the Gothic architecture of Spain, and there's a picture there on the right hand side, which is a sketch he took from Santiago Cathedral. And both of those books can be downloaded on the internet, and I really do recommend, if you are a fan of architecture and of Street in particular, you do have a look at those. The memoir of G.E. Street's is also available on the internet and definitely well worth a look. That was written by his son Arthur Edmund Street, who lived from 1855 to 1938, and that was published in 1881. So it just shows the significance and impact that Street had upon Victorian society. Turn to Street's London churches. Let me take you to St Mary Magdalene in Paddington and its eye-catching interior there. This was built in 1868-78, and just like in Pimlico, this was a church, a lavish, beautifully ornate and decorative church built in a poor urban area. Now, it was built during the Tractarian movement. I'm not going to go deep into the internal politics of the Anglican Church and the various different movements of the Victorian time on this presentation, but basically it was high church Anglican, extremely decorative, rather than bare and austere, that some more of the puritanical type followers of the Church of England would have preferred. This was more influenced by the Catholic style, and Gothic revival was definitely very lush. The whole Gothic revival movement, in some ways, was spearheaded by Augustus Pugin, who designed Catholic churches and was a very strong Catholic. So you can see there's repercussions and underlying reasons why certain styles were taken up by the Gothic revivalists like Street. St Mary Magdalene is tall, decorated all over inside, including the roof, with saints leaning from their niches in the space between the windows and the arcade. And these particular saints were carved by a gentleman called Thomas Earp. And you can see the wonderful columns within the church, lush variety of different colours, both in the stained glass and also in the stonework just underneath, gorgeous interiors. And again, the ceilings at St Mary Magdalene are just absolutely breathtaking. If you can go and visit that church, it's highly recommended, and it really is Street's interiors at their most sumptuous best. Another church in the Westminster area, St James's in Westbourne Street, again is Street, now that he's arrived in London, now that he's getting the large commissions which are well funded, it really allows his artistic expression to go to the utmost. And you can just see there in the photographs I've put there, sometimes pictures paint 1,000 words, and just look at those interiors and the craftsmanship that Street would have both guided and overseen, and it really is magnificent. The last church that I'll talk about for Street in London is St John the Divine in Kennington. Now, Kennington, any cricket fans will know Kennington as near where the Oval is for Surrey Cricket Ground and the Test matches. So don't get confused if you don't know London with Kensington. Kennington is a different part. It's south of the river. And St John the Divine, a lovely spire, lovely tower on the right hand side, as you can see, and then beautiful columns on the left hand side, with again the very notable Gothic revivalist feature of the pointed arches leading up to the altar. Now, I found an interesting artistic 1960s impression of streets, churches by the artist Piper. And this is a painting that he produced in 1964 of St Mary's, Paddington. I put the church spire and the photograph of the church on the right-hand side and Piper's painting on the left-hand side, just to give you a chance to compare the two. I quite like what Piper's done here, and it's just another way of looking at Street's work through the eyes of a 1960s viewpoint. And another example by John Piper can be seen here. Now, it's rather dark, brooding, quite Gothic in a way, and that's the Church of St James the Less, Westminster, by John Piper. And on the right-hand side, you can see the actual church itself and the tower. And I think you'll agree that Piper has caught the spire and the tower quite effectively. So interesting, just a different way to have a look at Street's work that I thought you might appreciate having a look at. And then the last building I want to talk about for Street in London, before we have a look at some of his overseas architecture, is the Wellington Barracks Chapel in London. Now, this is near Buckingham Palace. It was originally designed by another architect in the 1830s. However, Street was involved in the restoration, as he had been in cathedrals, in the 1870s in a very decorative Byzantine style. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's okay. He supplied a photograph of the church, but why a black and white photo? Well, the sad news on this one, and this is very much an element of tragedy in the Street story, is that World War II removed this Street's work in a tragic fashion, as we shall see in the next slide. So in June 1944, sadly, the chapel was hit by a flying bomb, a V1 sent over by the Nazis, and it destroyed the church, and it led to 121 deaths. It's one of the lesser known aspects of World War II Blitz that hit London, was this terrible tragedy in the heart of London, just near Buckingham Palace, as I say. Now, thankfully, after World War II, the chapel was redesigned and rebuilt, and the current chapel is designed by an architect called Bruce George, which was built in 1963. And so the next slide is what the chapel by Bruce George looks like. So that's the current chapel, as you can see. So this is not a street piece of work, but some of those regimental colour flags would have possibly been in the original church. I'm not quite sure, but it's an interesting insight into what the chapel looks like today. So, moving away from London for a brief moment, let's have a look at some of the work that G Street was involved in Ireland. And he was involved in work in a number of different towns in Ireland, but I'm going to focus just on one building today, and that's Christ Church Cathedral, Dublin. Now, this is the hub of the Anglo-Irish Protestant community, the Church of Ireland, as it's called in Ireland. And what Street was involved in this particular building, which dates much before Street, is he was involved in the restoration work between 1871 and 1878. It was paid by the whiskey distiller Henry Rowe, and it was a cost of £230,000 pounds in 1870. So just to give you a rough financial equivalent, that's 34 million pounds. However, to do that level of restoration on a cathedral now for 34 million pounds, it would cost a lot more. So as I've put on the slide, good luck with that if you think you can find anybody to do it for 34 million, particularly in such an expensive city as Dublin. Another church that, and this surprises quite a few people, is he was involved in building Anglican churches in Rome. You think of the center, the epicenter of Roman Catholicism in Rome, and here was Street building Anglican churches. So we have here, first of All Saints. In 1860, the Pope gave English visitors and residents the right to hold Anglican services in Rome. But it wasn't until the 1880s they acquired the site to build their own church. And so Street built this in a neo-Gothic style. And while the interior has different coloured Italian marbles, it very much retains an atmosphere and an English air. And so that's All Saints. The other, and here is the second church that Street was involved in Rome, St. Paul's Within the Walls, otherwise known as the American Church. And this church is again really well worth a visit if you ever find yourself in Rome. The interior is a jewel of pre-Raphaelite art designed by Edward Burne-Jones. Again, it shows Street working with talented artists. Yes, he was a micromanager, but he knew when to bring other talents in on those parts where, he recognized that others were more talented, like Burne-Jones. He designed the St. Christopher, this is Burne-Jones. He designed the St. Christopher window in Wigan Parish Church, fitted in 1868, as I may have mentioned in part one of the presentation. And about St. Paul's Within the Walls, this was the first Protestant church to be built in Rome and was completed in 1880. And it really does show the importance and influence that the English community had throughout the world at that time, that they were able to build one of their own churches within Rome itself. So I now want to take you to Istanbul in Turkey to show you possibly the most exotic location that Street ever designed in. And this is the wonderful Crimean Memorial Church. And this, I'm fortunate enough to have spent a week in Istanbul a few years ago, and so I took these photographs myself. You can see it's quite an Anglican style church, both on the exterior and in the interior. That's the wonderful choir screen you can see on the right-hand side. And then it was interesting because the day we actually went to visit the Crimean Memorial Church, as we approached the entrance, you can just about see on the left-hand side we were greeted by an unusual visitor to the church, which was a chicken. So not your everyday entrance to arrival at a street building, but gave it a degree of uniqueness, let us say. So a little bit about this Crimean Memorial Church. It was on land donated by Sultan Abdulmecid, and was constructed between 1858 and 1868. And thanks to Peter Fleetwood for pointing me towards an excellent article on archiseek.com about this chapel's construction. Amongst the people that contributed to the chapel's raising for the funds were Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. The original architect wasn't William Burgess, but he was replaced by G. Street in 1863 due to concerns over Burgess's un-English style. Whereas, as we've seen, what Street has produced is very much a traditional Church of England, but with a degree of Gothic revivalism. All stones used in the construction of this church were bought from Malta, and it was built to honour the British soldiers and sailors who died in the Crimean War. Now, sadly, as you know in English history, it wasn't the only time that English lives would be lost in Crimea, in Turkey. It was the 1860s. In World War I, 1914 to 1918, of course, a number of British soldiers lost their lives in the terrible Battle of Gallipoli, and the wooden screen erected in 1923 is in memory of those who died in Gallipoli in 1915 to 1916. So, although Street himself was long gone by this stage, I'm sure he would have appreciated that touch. And the church is located, if you are in Istanbul, you can see it's located around the Taksim district of Istanbul. So I really do recommend a visit to that if you want to see a rather unique. And there's a graveyard nearby of British soldiers to commemorate, with some of the bodies that sadly lost their lives in the Crimean War. That was the war made famous by Mary Seacole and Florence Nightingale, the English nurses and Caribbean nurse who went over to save a number of the soldiers' lives. So let's now talk about G Street's most famous building, his masterpiece, the Gothic masterpiece he will always be remembered for. And there's a wonderful sketch there, The Selected Architect. That gives you a little bit of a clue that this was a competition to select an architect. And as we shall see, that selection process was far from straightforward. But I love this drawing on the left-hand side. You can see the design for the new law courts on the big poster sketch that he's got in his hands. And Street's bushy beard really looks like it's been allowed to go wild and woolly, as he's focused his attention less on his beard and more on his creative architectural skills. So let's talk about the Royal Courts of Justice. Why was it needed to be constructed? Well, by the 1800s, legal London's courts were based in different parts of London. Some were based in Westminster, and they really were in a number of different series of higgledy-piggledy, out-of-date, dilapidated buildings which were inadequate for the world's biggest industrial and economic power. So a site was purchased on the Strand to be the base for civil law in the capital. Remember, when I talk about the Royal Courts of Justice, this is the headquarter of the civil law in the English legal system, whereas the Old Bailey is the criminal law. So the Old Bailey courtroom that you'll see on television, that usually involves in murder cases such as the Yorkshire Ripper and various other notorious cases, whereas by and large the Royal Courts of Justice focuses on civil law. And competition was held to design the building. Remember, my presentation that also is available, that was hosted by the Wigan Local History and Heritage Society on Alfred Waterhouse, which can be found on the YouTube channel. I talk in more detail about the Manchester Town Hall competition, but this was a similar architectural competition where a number of notable architects put forward their plans, and then one was selected, or that was going to be the theory at least. So let's talk about that competition. It was held in between 1866 to 1867, and 11 notable architects were invited to compete, including Alfred Waterhouse. His entry I haven't included here, but I've shown you in my presentation on the Alfred Waterhouse work. So if you do want to see Waterhouse's entry, then I suggest you have a look at my Waterhouse presentation. Now, the competition entries were shown in public in Lincoln's Inn. 7 judges to decide the winner. So you have 11 architects decided by 7 different judges, which, if you ask me, was always going to be an invitation for it to be a little bit messy. And indeed, what happened were the 7 judges couldn't decide amongst themselves who would win, so they decided we were going to have joint winners, G.E. Street and E.M. Barry. Each received 4 votes, but they couldn't agree on a compromise building. Now, Alfred Waterhouse wasn't happy with this verdict of the work going to Street and Barry and a joint winner. So he appealed in writing because he had won 3 votes, but he didn't win a majority. So a decision was made by the Attorney General that a sole architect had to be selected because they couldn't have a compromise between Street and Barry. So GE eventually got the job. just to give you an idea of what Barry's proposal was, there's the sketch of his proposal, 1867. And to tell you a little bit about Edward M. Barry, he was the son of Charles Barry. Now, Charles Barry is the architect who designed the houses, the exterior of the Houses of Parliament, which again, some people would argue is the finest Gothic revival building in the whole of London. Others might say, no, it's the Royal Courts of Justice, but it's one of those, both are stunning buildings, and it really is up to you to decide which one you prefer. So let's talk about the actual building itself of the Royal Courts of Justice. It has over 1,000 rooms. It has the law courts. So sometimes on television, if you hear in the law courts today a case X was discussed, then this is the building they'll be talking about. It has a notable main hall, has a number of religious references. That G.E. Street, we know his Anglican background, we know his strong faith. He included that. He very much saw justice as linked to religion and morality and Victorian morality. So there's statues of Solomon, Alfred, and Moses. And I've just put here a number of notable trials that have occurred within the Royal Courts of Justice. In 1934, there was a notorious Aleister Crowley black magic trial. In 1987, Jeffrey Archer sued the Daily Star. In 2021, we've had a very notable drama on ITV, which refers to this case, the Court of Appeal, the sub-postmasters against the Royal Mail. You might have seen the ITV drama. And then just recently, just this week, as I'm making this presentation, recording this presentation, Prince Harry has lost his case against the Home Office in terms of adequate provision of security being provided for him. And that was decided in the Royal Courts of Justice. So you can see it really is, it's also been famous for a number of music people having legal battles with their recording company. For example, George Michael against Sony. Again, this Royal Courts of Justice was the venue for that notable case as well. So it really is the centre of civil law in England. But to tell you more about the interior of the building and to show you an example, then you've got two wonderful photos here. I talked about the main hall, and you can see that on the right-hand side. Some notable Gothic traits there of the pointed arches and the use of lovely different coloured stones and attention to detail with the columns. And then on the left-hand side, again, big, chunky, wonderfully carved columns. And, when you do guided tours of the Royal Courts of Justice are available, and they can be booked on the internet. Just check the Royal Courts of Justice website. And it really is a building that's worth visiting just to see the intricate stonework and architecture that Street produced. And I very much, when I went on a guided tour of the building, you felt you really were more in a building that felt like a cathedral than actually a court of law, apart from when you went into some of the rooms, which definitely were actual courts. And the beautiful public areas, just with the stonework and their size and scale, are extremely impressive, as you can see on that slide. So I do strongly recommend a visit to the Royal Courts of Justice. And Street is forever remembered in the building. You might remember the very first slide I showed you the picture of Street, and that's where the picture of Street's statue, that's where this statue can be found within the Royal Courts of Justice. And again, on the right-hand side there, you can see sumptuous interior. If you hadn't have known that was in the Royal Courts of Justice designed by Street, you might have said that's possibly the Houses of Parliament and an interior designed by Pugin, another Gothic revivalist. And I'm sure Pugin's intricate and historically based creative work was very much an influence and within Street's mind when he designed this building. So it was opened by the Queen in 1882, but sadly GE died in 1881, so he never saw the opening ceremony. which is, is a real heartbreaker. That here was a man who spent years involved in the construction of this building, and yet sadly he never saw it to its glorious end. Queen Victoria, notable for wearing mourning black ever since the death of her beloved Prince Albert in the 1860s. And here, 20 years on, she's still in mourning black, and she continued that until her death in 1901. And just another couple of examples of how the opening ceremony with Queen Victoria was captured by artists of the day. You can see there her Queen Victoria on the royal carriage on the right hand side, and then in a beautiful painting on the left hand side by Henry Tanworth Wells, her involved in the opening ceremony. So, whilst G Street wasn't there, his son, who had partly taken over some of the works for the completion of the Royal Courts of Justice, he was present for the opening. And I'm sure his father was very much in his son's thoughts during that ceremony. But one last building in London I wanted to bring your attention to is something very different in terms of style. And it just shows that G Street, yes, he was neo-Gothic, Gothic revivalist, certainly, but he was also capable of stretching the creative works to different styles. So in this temple at Norwood Cemetery, you can see that he very much created it in the Byzantine style. And it really is an interesting building. So if ever you find yourself in Norwood Cemetery in that neck of the woods near London, again, it's something to look out for. So as we come to towards the end of the presentation, as well as we've had a look at his notable church and his different buildings, I wanted to give you just a little sense of the man himself and his private life. So he was married. His first wife was a lady called Marietta, and they were happily and successfully married for between 1852 and 1874. And sadly, then Marietta died. He had a son, Arthur, who we've discussed about before, born in 1855 and lived a good long life until 1938. He himself became an architect, and as I said, took over the work involved in the Royal Courts of Justice. The son, Arthur, had a traditional Victorian successful profession, education in terms of he went to Eton and then Oxford. He joined his father's practice in 1878, and from 1882 to 1920 was connected with 30 different religious commissions. But I think it's fair to say that Arthur's real passion was poetry and literature. And it's nice to know that he wasn't just creatively crippled by having to stay in architecture. He was able to indulge his other passions. And his father very much saw architecture as an extension of art and poetry and faith. So I think the father would have approved of Arthur's wide interest rather than just limit himself to architecture solely. The second wife, and sadly this is a tragic story in itself, was Jessie Mary Ann Holland. Now, G Street, the marriage took place on the 11th of January 1876. But only 2 months later, less than 2 months later, sadly, Jessie died at their home in 14 Cavendish Place in Marylebone. And the window of the of St Anne's in Dublin Christchurch Cathedral, the Protestant cathedral that G Street was involved in the restoration, designed and dedicated a window to Mary by him. And if ever you're in that cathedral, do have a look out for that window for his second wife. And that really is tragic that she died so soon after their marriage. And unfortunately, it wasn't that many years ago or many years after the marriage that G self passed away. He died at home in 14 Cavendish Place on the 18th of December, 1881, after suffering 2 strokes. It's certainly true that his death was hastened by overwork and exhaustion, connected with the erection of the law courts, but I also feel it must have been a blow to his morale and to his mental health that he thought he'd found love for a second time with his wife, and she died less than 2 months after the wedding. So I'm sure it was a combination of both work and the tragedy of his second wife. GE is buried within the nave of Westminster Abbey, actually right next to his mentor, George Gilbert Scott. So if ever you're in the nave of Westminster Abbey, directly ahead of the choir screen, which has the statue dedicated to Isaac Newton, then if you have a look at the floor, there's usually the chairs are there, but have a look on the floor on the left-hand side around that area of the nave, then you'll find the plaque to both George Gilbert Scott and also to GE. And this is a wonderfully ornate plaque, symbolism of plenty. And it was designed by somebody, George Frederick Bodley, who had worked in Scott's office and had known GE, very well. And amongst the people to pay tribute to GE Street was in fact Alfred Waterhouse. So despite the fact that Waterhouse had appealed that original decision that he didn't win the Royal Courts of Justice, it's nice that professional jealousy didn't override Waterhouse's admiration for GE Street. So I think there was a lot of admiration from both men towards each other about their creative skills and artistic work. And thank you for listening. So if you do have any comments or questions, please leave those in the box below. I'll try and check the YouTube comments on a regular basis. As I say, my name has been Sean Jinks. This has been a presentation on behalf of the Wigan Local History and Heritage Society. If you have enjoyed it, leave some positive comments and put a thumbs up. And also do have a look at my other presentation on Alfred Waterhouse, because I think if you're interested in Gothic architecture and Gothic revival architecture, you'll also appreciate Waterhouse's work. And he too did some important buildings in not only Wigan, in the Northwest, but in London too. So I do recommend, if you're a fan of Street, have a look at the Waterhouse presentation too, as well as all the other excellent presentations that we can find on the Wigan Local History and Heritage website on YouTube. So and I certainly encourage you to join our society, and everyone is very welcome. So I hope you've enjoyed my presentation. It's my own little humble tribute to the great Victorian man, G. Street, on what is this year is his anniversary of his birth. Thank you very much for listening.